Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of New South Wales and the 2018 Wallace Wurth Lecture. It's a great pleasure to see so many people here. I know that there are some people looking for seats. If by any chance you do have an empty seat next to you, I hope you can move up so that the remaining people can find somewhere to sit. I'm Anne Mossop from the Centre for Ideas, which is the university's new platform for creating important public conversations. Before we get started tonight, a couple of matters of housekeeping. Can I please ask you to put your phone on silent? As I said, if anybody can see an empty seat next to them, do encourage one of our latecomers to hop into it. And if you want to tweet about tonight's event, the hashtag is UNSWIdeas. We'll be hearing tonight from Daniel Dennett, who comes to us from a sojourn in Darwin as the Charles Darwin Scholar at Charles Darwin University, which for a Darwinist, he has just told us, was something that was irresistible. He's going to be talking to us tonight about human consciousness and what we have learnt about consciousness in the last 50 years. He'll be introduced shortly by our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Ian Jacobs, but first I want to welcome Uncle Lloyd Walker to present the Welcome to Country. Uncle Lloyd is an Aboriginal man and a respected member of the La Perouse community. He's a renowned sportsman who's represented Australia as part of the Wallabies, and he's currently a member of the New South Wales Parole Board. Uncle Lloyd Walker.
Nai gang bai, nai gang Lloyd Walker, Gararo da, Naro ne, Bagajuna, Nurda, Baba Maraja, Nubu Marana, Nuranai ne, Yagan, Gamari nai, Darulanga, Garuguru, Norna, Maruja, Nala. Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the La Perouse Local Aboriginal Land Council and the La Perouse Aboriginal community, I welcome you today. In my opening remarks in the local Aboriginal language of the area, I said, "Hello, my name is Lloyd Walker. I live at La Perouse, belong to coastal Sydney. My grandfather's grandmother lived in the country some time ago. I was speaking to you in Darawal. We stand on the land people belonging to Gadai. The families of the La Perouse Aboriginal community a traditional and ongoing connection to coastal Sydney and the Illawarra. Like many Aboriginals' identities in the late 1700s, early 1800s and mid-1800s, including William Worrell, Thomas Tamara and Billy Wentworth. Our families continue to keep the traditional connections and movement of their ancestors. My grandfather's grandmother, Mary Russell, was from coastal Sydney, and my grandfather's grandfather, Joseph Dixon, was from the Illawarra region. Our people moved freely between coastal Sydney and the Illawarra region until the formation of the New South Wales Aboriginal Protection Board in 1883, when the La Perouse Aboriginal camp became a permanent reserve, forcing Aboriginal people of coastal Sydney to be out of sight and out of mind of the colony. 135 years later, and Sydney growing around us, we still remain on our country and working to ensure our community can remain in our traditional lands for the next 135 years and beyond. Once again, on behalf of the La Perouse Local Aboriginal Land Council and the La Perouse Aboriginal community, I welcome you here today and hope you have an enjoyable event. Before I conclude, in Aboriginal culture, traditionally we don't have a word for saying goodbye, as we believe that we will always see our family and friends again, even after death. So we use the term Nanawabi, which translates to I'll see you later. So in closing, I'll say Nanawabi, and you can respond by saying back to me Nanawabi. Nanawabi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uncle Lloyd Walker. I'd now like to welcome the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Ian Jacobs, to the stage to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone, colleagues, special guests, students, staff, alumni, members of the public, and friends of UNSW. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for the 2018 Wallace Wurth Lecture. I'd like to add my thanks to Uncle Lloyd Walker for the welcome to country, and I too would like to pay my respects to the Bedegal elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders present here today. My congratulations to Anne Mossop and her team on the success of this lecture series. It is fantastic to see such a full, vibrant lecture theatre. This is, in so many ways, a key part of what our university is about, so you really are all so welcome here this evening. The Wallace Wurth Lecture Series is named after Wallace Charles Wurth, UNSW's first Chancellor. It means a lot that we have members of the Wurth family here tonight. It's wonderful to have you in the room as we honour such a great man's legacy. It was due to Wallace Wurth's vision 70 years ago that UNSW takes the form that it does today. As a centre for world-class education, cutting-edge research, and the free exchange of ideas. It's in recognition of that vision that we invite an eminent speaker to deliver a lecture every year in his name. Our guest tonight will not only give us a great deal to think about, he'll also make us question how and why we think at all. A graduate of Harvard and Oxford, our speaker has spent his life teaching and studying the human mind, concerning himself with the types of questions most people would, quite ironically, find too difficult to even comprehend. The relationships between free will, consciousness, mind, and meaning. He's the author of more than a dozen books explaining the magic of consciousness, among them Breaking the Spell, Freedom Evolves, and Darwin's Dangerous Idea. His most recent book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds, brings age-old questions about selfhood into the modern day. It builds on computer science, artificial intelligence, and biology to explore how to distinguish the mind from the brain. To borrow a quote from a Nature Journal review last year, our speaker continues to earn his reputation as one of today's most readable, intellectually nimble, and scientifically literate philosophers. Indeed, to followers and critics alike, he is considered one of the most influential philosophers and cognitive scientists of our time. He's been described as a philosophical troublemaker, a die-hard Darwinian, and 1/4 of the 4 horsemen of atheism. He's been outspoken on politics, and while he's described our current era as, and I quote, entering a period of epistemological murk and uncertainty that we've not experienced since the Middle Ages, our speaker tonight remains overall an optimist. He is, of course, Daniel Dennett, Professor of Philosophy and co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University in Massachusetts. On top of his books, Professor Dennett has published more than 400 journal articles, received a host of prestigious fellowships, some of them in Australia, and presented important lectures at universities all over the world. We are indeed extremely fortunate to have someone of Daniel's esteem here to inform, excite, and I expect challenge all of us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Dennett.
Good evening. Can I have the house lights up a bit? I really like to see faces more than I can see them now, just a bit, if that's possible. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you, Uncle Lloyd. Thank you, Ann Mossop, for putting this together. And thank you all for showing up for this occasion. So, let's go. This is my favorite picture of consciousness, and it's about 50 years old. It was a New Yorker cover done by the late, great Saul Steinberg back in, I think, 1969. And in it, you see a man looking at a painting and identifying it as Braque. That reminds him of the word Baroque and Barrack and Bark and Poodle. This is his stream of consciousness. And it goes on, and I don't want you to pay too much attention to it, because then you won't pay attention to me. I often show this, and I have different messages to bring about this wonderful, to me, the single best drawing of consciousness I've ever encountered. The important thing to remember is that it's metaphorical. Consciousness doesn't actually exist in a little bubble or balloon or cloud above your head. And it doesn't actually have those colors and shapes and words just like that, written in ink. But as a metaphorical depiction of what consciousness is like, it strikes a lot of chords. I think everybody here says, oh yeah, that's a stream of consciousness. And you can learn a lot about this man by following it along, but I'm not going to let you do that. Now, when I say it's metaphorical, and I tell you that it is a metaphorical drawing of consciousness, I'm labeling the man as a conscious agent. But some philosophers think that in addition to conscious agents, there are what philosophers call zombies. Not the scary ones like this, that the living dead, but a philosophical zombie is behaviorally indistinguishable from a normal human being, but there's nobody home. There's no consciousness. And some of your best friends may be zombies. The whole point, as it's defined, is that there is no behavioral test at all of any complexity or subtlety that will distinguish an unconscious zombie from a normally conscious human being. To me, that's a self-refuting idea. It is simply nonsense. And to try to drive that home, I want to point out that Steinberg's drawing is not only a brilliant metaphorical depiction of consciousness, it's also a brilliant metaphorical depiction of the stream of unconsciousness of a zombie. In fact, if there were zombies, they would have to have the same sorts of processes going on in their head as go on in conscious people's heads, because after all, they've got to have the same associations and respond with terror, delight, or whatever to all of the things that a conscious person does. So is this a stream of unconsciousness or a stream of consciousness? You can't tell. The only way you can tell is by putting a label on it. Conscious, zombie. And there's no meat to that at all. There's just simply no substance to the very idea. So that's the last thing I'll say about zombies. Here's another picture of consciousness. And this is also of about the same era. It was a satirical drawing done in an article in Life magazine in the United States back in the 50s. Actually, this goes back even a bit further. And in it, you can see the light coming in through the camera lens and exposing some film, which then gets developed. And I love the little fan that dries off the film before it goes through the projector. And then it's shown on the screen where not one but two little people in white coats look at the screen. Now, the whole point of this is to make fun of a bad idea about consciousness. And that's the idea that I call the Cartesian theater. The idea that there's a place in your brain where the show happens for the delectation of an inner witness. It may seem that way, but that's not the way it works. That's just not true. Now, one thing is now clear, well, to most workers in the field. There could be a Cartesian theater, but there isn't. I'm going to prove to you that there could be with a little film clip which shows, I think, completely coherently and without any inner contradictions at all, the Cartesian theater. Some of you may know this.
Look at this.
This is Men in Black.
What the hell is that?
This corpse is being looked at in the morgue. That's the Cartesian theater. Loudspeakers for the little man to hear. 2 screens to look at, lots of buttons to push.
Contest.
It's okay. What are you trying to say?
To prevent.
Well, that's enough.
Prevent.
The point is, suppose we wanted to go to the planet of the giant people and we wanted to pass for a giant person. Maybe the way to do it would be to make a humongous puppet, a marionette of sorts, and put a human being in the control room. And technically very difficult, but not presumably impossible. So a Cartesian theater is a possibility. But, you know, empirical fact, we've looked and there isn't one. There could have been, but there isn't. So now the moral of the Cartesian theater is this. All the work done by the imagined homunculus in the Cartesian theater must be distributed around to various lesser agencies in the brain. If there's no homunculus sitting at the controls, then something else must be controlling a human body. And it isn't a homunculus, and it's not in this central control tower. So how is that done? That's the hard question we're tackling these days, and we're making some nice progress on it. In 2013, in Belgium, at the Delvaart Symposium, Jean-Pierre Changeux, one of the leading researchers, gave a talk called Toward a Molecular Biology of Conscious Processing, How Higher Brain Functions Emerge from Signal Transmission Mechanisms. This is the famous global neuronal workspace model that he developed with Stan Dehaan and his colleagues in Paris. And it is, by my lights, the best current model in various different forms of it. And you'll be grateful to know I'm not going to walk you through the details. This is Jean-Pierre's slide, which he gave me graciously to use. And I'm not going to talk about the neuromodulators or the various other things. And you can't even read the writing on the right. I think it's too pale. I should have gone through and recolored all of Jean-Pierre's slides. But I want to draw your attention to one little bit, which is right there. But this is what it says. It says, at this point, this activity yielding subjective experience of being conscious and reportability. And at the meeting in Belgium, I asked him if he could perhaps explicate that phrase a little bit. Yielding subjective experience of being conscious and reportability. It seemed an awful lot packed into those words. I asked him how he would further explain it. And he answered in a way that could only please a philosopher. And it pleased me mightily. His answer was this: what do you think I should say? And I've been working on that ever since. And what I'm going to be doing today is telling you what I think Jean-Pierre should have said. And sort of, he and Stan Dehaan and most people, that's what they say now. But let's look at it. So here's what he should have said. First, let me describe two different user illusions. One of them is the desktop user illusion, or you could use your smartphone user illusion, but let's talk about the desktop. There's icons and little file folders, and you can click and drag and move things around, and you get a few side effects and all the rest. Now that user illusion, that's the term that the people, the software engineers use for the human user interface with a computer, has been designed by engineers to be user-friendly, a user-friendly set of metaphors that simplify narcissistically. They tell you what you want to know. They don't bother you with things of no interest to you. They feed your needs as best they can. And this has been brilliantly designed by engineers. Intelligent design, small I, small d. The conscious experience user illusion has been designed by evolution by natural selection to be a user-friendly set of metaphors that simplify narcissistically. Took a lot longer, but it was a harder job in any case. And what that does is it creates what the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars called a manifest image. The manifest image, according to Sellars, is to be contrasted with the scientific image. The scientific image is the world of quarks and photons and electrons and protons and molecules and the like. While the manifest image is full of people and tables and chairs and sunsets and voices and dollars and all the other paraphernalia of everyday life. The stuff that matters to you. All the things that you ought to be able to track and pay attention to easily in a user-friendly way. And evolution has made it possible, not just for you, but for all species, to have a simplified view of the world which tracks the things that matter to that species. So, for instance, an anteater with a big, long, sticky tongue doesn't have to track individual ants. Can treat ants as like sugar, just some more ant, thank you. Whereas an insectivorous bird catching flying insects has to track individual insects. There's a difference in the manifest image of those two species. Insects are just, a philosopher would say, a mass term for the anteater. It's like water or glue or sugar. But for the bird, you got to track the individuals. It's a sortal, as we say. Well, there's another name for these items, and that's Gibsonian affordances. The late J.J. Gibson, a very controversial figure in psychology in the 20th century, and in 1979 he published an important book called The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And in that book he introduced this term affordances, made it up himself, and so it's a technical term. And it's based on the verb to afford in the sense of this hotel room in Sydney affords a view of Coogee Beach. It means that it provides. It's not afford like I can't afford that, it's too expensive. It's affordance in the sense of providing, making available to an organism. So those are affordances. And that's what our manifest image is populated with, lots of affordances. There's tables to sit at and chairs to sit on and glasses to drink water out of and windows to look out of and doors to walk through and holes to fall into and all the rest. So Gibson's affordances are opportunities. As he said, what the environment offers the animal for good or ill. Perceptual motor systems are designed to discern and respond appropriately to affordances. This is a fundamental design problem that evolution has solved for many species. The things that matter for good or ill to that organism are the things that that organism ought to track, ought to discern, ought to pay attention to, and ought to be poised to act on as opportunities when they arise. So a simple way of thinking about affordances. Wouldn't it be nice to just perceive all the things that matter to us? I'm going to make up an example. In the future, you may be able to wear a device or implant one that labels everything in the world that matters to you. So here's a scene, complicated scene. Well, now suppose what matters to you right now is lawyers. Well, what does a lawyer look like? Well, there's not really much in common visually to lawyers. By the way, the one in the upper right is Barbara Underwood, and if you don't know of her, I hope you soon know a lot more of her. She's the district attorney of New York, and she's been on the trail of the Trump empire for some time. I don't think I need to identify all the others. But so you could, though, thanks to the Internet of Things, you could have a device that you wore which simply labeled the various people, and there's a lawyer, and there's a pickpocket. A couple of things that matter. But of course, such a system might well not use words as labels. It might, use an L and a danger sign of some sort. And the main thing is it wouldn't have to use anything, but just have a label that somehow feeds directly into your dispositions. Nature has already done this. That's why I raised this example. What this device would do is what nature is doing anyway. And you might get so used to this user-friendly innovation that if you lost the device, you'd feel you'd been struck blind. You'd be so used to just being able to pick out the lawyers and pickpockets directly because they would be all nicely labeled in a language that you can understand. No use labeling them in English if you don't speak English. But then again, no use putting them in English at all anyway. You could just use symbols of some sort, as long as you have something that can react to that symbol appropriately. Responding to an affordance, well, sometimes the answer is run, sometimes it's duck down, sometimes hide, eat, sometimes hide behind it. And then there's a million other things that you might respond appropriately to an affordance. I just want to put this idea in your head of how perception might be organized, not as a bunch of pictures, but as a bunch of signaled affordances for you to deal with as best you could. In order to control responses appropriately, the brain must identify, track, and represent the affordances, but need not render the affordance in any new medium at all. This is an important point. Affordances are not properties of internal renderings. They're properties discerned in the environment. Things like the property being liquid or red or shaped like a fish or being a lawyer. Now, the desktop user illusion is rendered in pixels of color on an LED screen. The consciousness user illusion isn't rendered in anything. It's the properties of the labels that matter, and the properties of the labels that matter that make a difference are the functional properties by which they're discerned or tracked by the next step in the neural processes. Now let's go back to Changeux. Yielding a subjective experience of being conscious and reportability. Well, here's how I would gloss that now that I've given you these terms. There are brain structures in the global neuronal workspace that can identify affordances, evaluate affordances, manipulate representations of affordances, choose between affordances, control reports of all this if anybody asks you any question. And a lot of you will think, yeah, but that kind of leaves something out. There's more to consciousness than that. Something all important. And a lot of people would say, the generation of qualia, those special inner subjective properties that our conscious experience is supposed to have. To which my answer is no. Qualia couldn't be important if they didn't have downstream effects. When we've accounted for all the downstream effects, we've accounted for qualia. Now, some people would say, no, we have to have transduction of the signals in the nervous system into some special phenomenal medium, whatever phenomenal means. It's conveniently not usually defined in any interesting way. But what I'm saying is that that would be going backwards, and I'm going to try to show you why. First, let's look at something simple, not transduction, but reflection. A periscope. Probably you've all experienced a periscope. Simply two mirrors. Let's see if this works. Nah, doesn't seem to. Well, oh, wait a minute. Am I pushing the right place? Yes, I am. Okay, never mind. Don't need the pointer. So there are two mirrors in the periscope, and when you look in the hole at the bottom, what you see from the point of view which is up here above your head. Now, of course, nothing is happening up there behind that first mirror. It's not as if we put a big block of lead right behind that mirror, it would somehow interfere with your perception, because the consciousness isn't happening there. It just seems to be happening there. But it isn't happening there. What's happening is happening in your brain, down between your ears. But it seems to have been projected or something up into this other space, but it's not there. But besides a periscope, as I said, it's just two mirrors, it's just reflection. There's the photons coming in, photons bouncing off the mirror, photons bouncing off the next mirror and bouncing into your eye where an image is formed on your retina. But we can easily imagine a slightly different kind of periscope. And in fact, I've recently seen it used very effectively by a plumber. Plumber wants to read the serial number on a fitting under the sink and can't see it very easily and doesn't want to crawl in on his back. So he takes his cell phone, holds it down underneath, takes a picture, pulls it out and looks at it. That's a sort of periscope. He's getting to his eye something which is otherwise not available to him. But the difference is that the cell phone is got two transduction events. First, the light coming into the camera is transduced into bits in an array on the screen. And then that information, that set of bits, is retranslated back out into color in the form of LED lights, cells on your screen so you can see it. So it's a sort of high-tech periscope with a double transduction in the middle. First into a electronic, let's just say an electronic string of bits, and then back from that electronic string of bits into colors. That's not what happens in the brain. Here's another old picture. This is from Frisbee's 1976, really textbook on seeing. And it explains a little bit about what goes on. You see the light bounces off the woman into those two eggs or golf balls. Those are the eyeballs. And is transduced by the rods and cones in the retina at the back of the eye. And that sends signals up through the various pathways, the optic chiasm, through the lateral geniculate nucleus. And finally, we arrive at a scene of activity at the back of the head, occipital cortex. And the artist has drawn the pattern of excitation that is actually there on your visual cortex if you were looking at that woman. You'll notice it's distorted, it's upside down and split. But that doesn't matter because nobody's looking at it. Nobody is looking at it. And of course, the artist has painted her lips red and her eyes blue. There's no red in occipital cortex. There's no blue or anything like blue in occipital cortex. It's just nerve excitation, spike trains in neurons in those areas. But it represents red and blue in the same way that bit strings in your cell phone represent red and blue when you take a picture. It's a code for representing properties. So the artist here, this is just as metaphorical as the Steinberg cover, because the artist has taken the liberty of actually using color to represent color in occipital cortex, when in fact that's not what happened. Shape is used to represent shape at this point. There really is a pattern of excitation, which in some cases can even be extracted by brain imaging so we can see what somebody's looking at. Because there is an image of excitation, but it's not colored. And the main thing is, it's not an image that is there to be seen by any eye. So now, how does the brain do the work that that picture describes metaphorically? If we want to understand this, we have to go back to one of the pioneering innovations of the mid-20th century, and that's the work of Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts. Way back in 1943, they developed an idea which was, I would say, the inspiration for cognitive science. What they developed was the McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron. Now, what you see here on the left is an artist's sketch of a neuron. It's sort of squiggly. There's a cell body, and there's a long axon, and then there's the dendritic branches. Those are the inputs, and the axon branches out dendrites, which then make contact with the next layer of cells and so forth. And what they did, McCulloch and Pitts did, is they simplified this down into a unit we see on the right, that's the cell body, and the 2 there means that it has a threshold of 2. And it has, you will see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inputs coming to it. 2 of them, 4 of them, the arrows, those are positive, those are excitatory, 2 are inhibitory. 4 minus 2 is 2, threshold is met. So this cell would fire. The arrow on the right would be on. So this is a very simple digital toy neuron that fires depending on how many of its inputs are firing at a particular moment, and there's a method of subtracting the inhibitory ones from the excitatory ones to see if you're above threshold. That's the basic idea of the McCulloch-Pitts neuron. But what they went on to prove mathematically from this is that a network of McCulloch-Pitts logical neurons can compute any computable function. Not any network can, but it is possible to design a McCulloch-Pitts neural network, which is like a Turing machine, like a computer. And with enough ingenuity, you can get it to do anything. It can do conditional branching and addition, and if it can do conditional branching and addition, then it can do anything. This was a great inspiration to a lot of people because it showed them that the brain could be a kind of computer. This oversimplification ignited the revolution known as cognitive science, and ever since then, a great many people, but not all, have thought, well, the brain is some kind of computer. It's not like your laptop, and it's not like your cell phone. And it's not even all that much like a logical, a McCulloch-Pitts network of logical neurons, but it's more like that than like the others. And it's something which transduces information into signals it can process. And those processes can yield anything you need. It can yield lawyer identification, or redness recognition, or there's a hole in the ground. It can transduce and recognize anything that you need. So we now have a sort of existence proof that affordances could be non-miraculously tracked, identified, discerned, and used to govern the opportunities of a living being without any mystery involved. Now, another part of that great simplification was the work of this man, Claude Shannon. This is his original 1948 diagram of a communication channel where you have a sender and a receiver and a source of noise that can interfere with the signal. And this is another brilliant oversimplification. And we're still dealing with some of the oversimplifications and work that I won't try to discuss tonight. But just it's from Shannon that we get the idea of a code that can be relatively impervious to noise and can transmit any information you like with high reliability. So here's Claude Shannon in 20 million questions. That is, I deliberately chose this photograph of Claude Shannon. It's a black and white photograph, and it's a 2.5 megabyte JPEG. And basically what that is 20 million, is the next dot black? No. Is the next dot black? Yes. Is the next dot black? No. Is the next dot black? No. Is the next dot black? Yes. You do that 20 million times, and you get this picture. Each one of those answers is a bit, 8 of them is a byte, 1 million of those is a megabyte, and so forth. As we know, Shannon's idea of encoding of information has swarmed all over the world and has made all the wonders of the computer age possible. That doesn't mean that the brain is using Shannon coding, but it means that Shannon coding can at least measure what the brain does in many instances. So now let's look at this item. It's a DVD, let's say, and let's compare it to old-fashioned film. On the left, we have 2001: A Space Odyssey on a DVD. On the right, we have it in film. The big difference, of course, is that in the film, color is used to represent color. In the DVD, color is not used to represent color. The DVD just has a recipe for transducing into color if you want to transduce it back into color. The information is there in any case. And it's this colorless information that I want to talk about. And a way of doing that is to look at the task of turning a drone into an autonomous vehicle. A lot of people talk about robots when they really mean drones, because there's still a human operator. But in principle, you can replace the human operator, you can discard the human operator and give all the control decisions over to onboard systems on the drone itself. Then you have an autonomous vehicle. So this is what a controller looks like. Many of you have probably used one of these, and you see the picture on the screen that the drone captures in its camera. And there we have one of those double transductions. The light comes into the camera on the drone a mile away and is transmitted not in light, not in photons. It's not like a periscope, but then there's a second transduction onto the screen that you can look at it. So we want to get rid of that because it's completely superfluous. Because if you're not going to have somebody with eyes and color vision looking at it, no point in having it in color. That's just going backwards. In fact, the drone, the drone with the controller that we see here, that's basically the Cartesian theater with an external theater. And we know that the brain doesn't have one of those. So we want to get rid of all the features of the control system that the brain doesn't need and can't use. And in particular, those are the intrinsic properties that are known as qualia. There's no transduction into a show in your head. It just seems that there is. There's no inner audience. It's spike trains all the way. That's very hard for a lot of people to grasp and accept. It's even hard for a lot of people in the field to get comfortable with this idea, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. So we have to get away from the Cartesian theater. And the way to do this is to see that control is distributed and accomplished by opponent processes, none of which is the king. There's tugs of war. There's a sort of anarchy, a sort of competition between various sub-agencies that want to take control. That's their job. And if you're lucky, the ones that win the competitions are the ones that are going to lead the body safely through life without any central boss at all. And these control processes are, in a word, not accessible to us. Us, the very owners of those bodies, the very owners of the heads in which all of this is happening, we don't have any access to those processes. And it does not involve, as I say, yet one more time, a second transduction into some other properties. Only transformations of the informational structures, which is very different from transduction. You're keeping it in spike trains and just using different data structures composed of those spike trains. So I helped you to the oversimplification of the McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron. Here's a couple of real neurons, and they don't look much like a McCulloch-Pitts neuron. They're sort of semi-independent, autonomous little agents. They have agendas of their own. No two are alike. That's what your brain is made of, not flip-flops that are all identical. Now, in order to make sense of that kind of an architecture, that kind of a control system, we have to abandon a very nice idea, which I and many other people spent a lot of work on in the 80s and 90s, and that's what I call the walking encyclopedia. This is good old-fashioned AI, or GoFi as it's often known. And what was brilliant about it was it took the task of controlling an agent through life, and it broke it down into very nice logical parts or modules. And you had your world knowledge store and your inference engine and your planning department and your language sentence formation department and parser for incoming language, perceptual analysis machinery. And it was all designed as if it was some mega corporation of units passing their work efficiently back and forth. A lot was learned from good old-fashioned AI, but one of the things that was learned is that's not how it's done. Good old-fashioned AI systems are brittle. Maybe you can understand the main problem with them if I simply say, remember the Y2K problem? That was a problem that was caused by some engineers who didn't worst case scenario the project they were working on well enough that, we only need a few bits for the year, and they would just run. They didn't think ahead. In a GoFi system, all the time when you're designing them, you're making worst case scenario guesses about how many variables you need, how many slots you need, how big the data structure is going to be. And if you guess wrong, you get systems that are hopelessly brittle and that just crash into the wall every time. We need to design architectures that are open-ended in a way that GoFi systems aren't, and that means they can't be designed by this top-down intelligent design method, even though that method has been a great source of insight and inspiration over the years. So to put it another way, not GoFi inside. What's inside is not at all like GoFi. It's a very different sort of computation. And we don't yet know how to model computation involving billions of autonomous, non-identical units. That's today's level of ignorance. There are people who are working on it, though, and I think they're making good progress. We have a bounty of avenues to pursue. And of course, they're all oversimplified, because that's what you do in science. You oversimplify until you can extract the meat from a perspective, and then you complicate it again. So what we've seen here, we start with something like a bitmap, which is an uncompressed image file, and we turn it into a JPEG, which is a compressed image file. It's already beginning to do some analysis. But now we have a whole lot of other data structures which take images as input and do more work with them. What they're doing is putting the labels on. Thus we have convolutional autoencoders, about which I will not say any more, but some people in the audience no doubt know what they are and realize that they're different from a JPEG in that they start. When you got a JPEG, you haven't got an affordance tracker yet. You've just got a picture. And you want to analyze that picture into something that can stand for an affordance. And it has to be more general, it has to be something that permits you to track and so forth. But we've got lots of other things coming down the pike, and I'm not going to say anything more about them, except to remind you once again, there's no rendering in the brain, no translation back into colors and shapes. There just seems to be to us. What I'm suggesting is that that consciousness is an illusion for us. It's an what happened there? It's an intellectual illusion. We suffer from it because we're so darn reflective. And we get thinking about what on earth is we doing with our brains? And we come up with this irresistible idea. I'm going to give you now, before I treat further of that, 3 examples of this sort of transformation. I think these will all work. These are sort of informal experiments. We'll start with the first one. Some of you may know this, I often use this. I want you just to fixate on the white cross. Everybody is fixated on the white cross? Ready? What'd you see? Did you see a flag? How many of you saw a flag? Okay, it works. I mean, even up in the back. Good. Now, those red stripes you saw, they don't exist. They didn't exist. They just seemed to exist. There was no red stripe on the screen. There was no red stripe on your retina. There was no red stripe anywhere. There was just the information that there was a red stripe in the world, and it wasn't red and it wasn't striped, and that's what you had in your head, and that's all. Don't go hunting for that red stripe. It's not in there. And it's not out there either. In fact, the only reason people think it's in the head is because they notice that if they move their head jiggle just a little bit, they see the red jiggle on the screen and think, well, I'm doing that. So it's got to be in here. Well, the information, the data structure is in there. It's not fixed on the wall. But there's no red in your head. Now I want to show you another one that I like. This was done by Bradley Dumais. I misspelled his name, and Petrie. And this was in Nature in 1976. You all know what a Necker cube is. It's one of those wire cube things which is ambiguous. So here's a slightly different Necker cube. Everybody can see that the Necker cube, and you can see that there's at least two different ways you can see it floating there in front of the black dots. Have you all got that? Okay, now let me point out that if you look at this, you may think I've cheated. You may think that if you look really closely, and here I wish I had a pointer, but maybe I can do it with this. If you look right along those lines, or right along this line, it almost seems like it's whiter than white, as if there's a boundary there. How can that be? Because your brain is basically drawing in that boundary. This is the machinery of simplifying, jumping to conclusions about what's there. But how many of you have noticed that in fact this figure is not two ways ambiguous, but 4 ways, in fact, more than 4. Because there's another way of looking at it. How many of you can see it as a Necker cube on a black background is seen through a piece of Swiss cheese? How many of you can see it? How many of you can't? Here's, just to help you. Now you can see it. A different phenomenon, when your brain sees it as behind the Swiss cheese, the brain is constructing a different data structure than when you see it as floating in front of the black dots. But the image hasn't changed. And now just to show you how really remarkable the construction talents of vision are, let's look at one more. Everybody can see the Necker cube, and notice that the color has to change behind the screen. But where does the color change happen? Nowhere. You don't have to. When your brain recognizes the Necker cube here, it doesn't have to send a small army of painters out to fill in behind the screen with the colors, and yet you see effortlessly that there's some sort of transition from one color to another behind the white. All right, those are very simple cases. Now I want to show you a more dramatic case, because more, in some ways, realistic. This is a painting by Bellotto. It hangs in the University of North Carolina Museum of Art in Durham. And Bellotto and Canaletto were contemporaries, and Canaletto was a detail freak. If you get up close to a Canaletto, I love to do this, and you can see every line of the rigging on the sails, and the buckles on the shoes, and the feathers on the cap, and everything. And I saw this painting the first time I saw it. It's big. It's about the same size, actually, as the painting, as the image on the screen. It's on a wall. And I wanted to see all the details, which I could sort of see were there. And I started running towards it, and I got closer and closer and closer, and I actually gasped. I was so surprised that the details weren't there. I could have sworn I saw those details from farther away. Now, what happened? Did the brain send out little detail painters to paint in the image in my arena of consciousness, in my Cartesian theater? No. The brain jumped to the conclusion, jumped to the expectation that there were details there. Those of you who are into Bayesian predictive coding can see how nicely the ideas of Bayesian predictive coding fit in with this picture, but I'm not going to scare you or bore you with that right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is simply talk a bit about this intellectual illusion that I mentioned, which I call now the power diagnosis of the illusion, because Richard Power, who is a recently retired AI researcher in England, sent me a letter in 2017, just a year ago, actually just about exactly a year ago, where he laid it out in such good terms. And then I met him a few weeks later in Edinburgh. There he is. And here's what Richard Power had to say. We understand the concept of representation from external representations such as pictures or verbal descriptions. For these representations, we can have direct experience of both a representer, e.g. portrait painting, and a representee, e.g. the person painted. Call these the medium and the content. Well, here's an example. We can see at once, at the same time, both the painting and what it's the painting of. And we can go back and forth between the two and compare and see, oh yeah, this blue here matches up with that blue, and the green of the dark green of the trees, here it is in the painting, and so forth. We're all familiar with that capacity to look at both the medium and the content and see how they line up. In short, we conceptualize the medium of our internal representations by abstracting some features from the content and attributing them to some kind of spiritual or ghostly substance. That is the best we can do, since actually we cannot experience the medium at all and have to look for analogies in the external world. This is the conceptual scheme that we bring to internal representations, because it's the only one we have. But there's a huge difference. For external representations, we can experience both medium and content, oil on canvas as well as people, trees, or whatever. But for internal representations, we do not experience the medium at all. Remember, the medium is spike trains. How many of you experience the spike trains in your visual cortex? I don't see any hands going up. The idea that the medium is some state of the brain seems intuitively absurd. So powerful is the illusion that we are dealing with an iconic representation in the medium of spirit. And thus, power suggests is dualism born. It can't be in the brain. There's got to be this other medium where the qualia are. Now, dogs and dolphins are neither dualists nor materialists, and so they are immune to this illusion. That doesn't mean they aren't conscious. It means they don't think there are qualia. Some people hate this idea. I've been presenting all this as sweet reason, but I want to, full disclosure, I want to let you all know that there are eminent people who very powerfully disagree with me on this, and I thought I would let you hear them say a few words about this. Daniel Dennett is the devil. There is no witness, no central recognizer of meaning, and no self other than an abstract center of narrative gravity, which is itself nothing but a convenient fiction. For Dennett, it is not a case of the emperor having no clothes, it's rather that the clothes have no emperor. Exactly right. If you still have an emperor in your theory of consciousness, you don't have a theory of consciousness yet. You got a homunculus in the control room. Until you get rid of that emperor, you don't have a theory at all. Another one. These authors are fascinating because they try to explain away their own conscious experience, their own qualia. As the philosopher John Searle puts it, how could an intelligent person paint themselves into such a corner? They certainly give it a good try, but as well as being crazy, it is, of course, also dehumanizing. They end up saying we are all some kind of deluded zombie or machine. No, we're machines, made of machines, made of machines, made of machines, but we're not deluded zombies unless we fall for the user illusion, the intellectual illusion, then we are, in a way, deluded zombies. That was a few years ago, but the attack has not subsided. Galen Strawson recently wrote a piece about the silliest claim ever made, and I made it. I'm very proud of that. Think of it. Thousands of years of idiocy, and I've made the silliest claim ever made. This is the great silliness. We must hope that it doesn't spread outside the academy or convince some future information technologist or roboticist who has great power over our lives. So be careful. Too bad if you listened. Even worse if you believe me. That's from his book, Things That Bother Me, Death, Freedom, the Self, etc. Here's one of the ways, this is the denial. One of the strangest things the deniers say is that although it seems that there's conscious experience, there isn't really any conscious experience. The seeming is, in fact, an illusion. The trouble with this, he says, is that any such illusion is already and necessarily an actual instance of the thing said to be an illusion. No, that's just confusion on his part. But I'm not going to bother unpacking it because I want to turn, well, after all, he's a philosopher. What are philosophers now? I want to turn to a couple of scientists. Christoph Koch, a good friend of mine, but also an ardent opponent, writing in Scientific American just a few months ago, Many modern analytic philosophers of mind, most prominently perhaps Daniel Dennett of Tufts University, find the existence of consciousness such an intolerable affront to what they believe should be a meaningless universe of matter and the void that they declare it to be an illusion. That is, they either deny that qualia exists, I do, or argue that they can never be meaningfully studied by science. If that assertion was true, this essay would be very short. But in some ways, an even more serious scientist, David Deutsch, in his book, The Beginning of Infinity. Qualia are neither describable nor predictable, a unique property that should make them deeply problematic to anyone with a scientific worldview, though in the main it seems to be mainly philosophers who worry about it. I consider this exciting evidence that there is a fundamental discovery to be made, which will integrate things like qualia with our other knowledge. Wow. Daniel Dennett draws the opposite conclusion, namely that qualia do not exist. Here's what I say: consciousness exists, but qualia do not. They are a misbegotten theoretical illusion, well described by Powers. Or, in other words, vision isn't television. If there is no second transduction, there is no place for qualia to be experienced and enjoyed or hated by an inner witness. Thanks for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Daniel Dennett for his talk to us this evening, for presenting the 2018 Wallace Wurth Lecture. We might have realised that we were about to be hearing from a confirmed Darwinist, but not that we were going to be hearing from the devil or the perpetrator of the great silliness. As I'm sure you'll agree, we've had the pleasure of listening this evening to somebody who has really defined this important field, which is so influential in terms of so many parts of what we understand about ourselves and the world. He's one of the few thinkers whose work is of equal significance to his academic peers and to the general audience, for whom he's given such lucid and inspiring accounts of some of the most important philosophical and scientific debates of our time. And we've seen tonight both that lucidity and inspiration, but also the spirit of fun and the spirit of combat that makes him such a beloved figure in the intellectual world. Daniel will be signing books in the foyer after this event, although you do have to be kind to him and realise that he's at the end of a long and gruelling trip and heading for home tomorrow. I want you to join me in thanking him again and saying that we would like to welcome him here again before too long to talk about the future of this fascinating field. Daniel Dennett.